Elvis did, he caused a lot of the populace, if you want to, and usually when people say populace, they usually mean white people, to start listening to a lot of music that normally they wouldn't have been listening. I don't think of Elvis like that because I know too many artists that are far.
Elvis was the undisputed king of rock and roll, a global icon who supposedly merged black rhythm and blues with white country music to change the world. But to Ray Charles, the blind genius who actually crossed those musical boundaries first, the Elvis phenomenon looked entirely different. In 1994, during a brutally honest television interview, Ray finally said out loud what many black artists had whispered in private for decades. His words did not just ruffle feathers. They completely shattered the carefully protected Hollywood narrative surrounding Elvis's legacy. It wasn't a malicious attack, but a cold, razor-sharp reality check on how the American music industry really worked when the color line was crossed. The Midnight Special broadcast. The red tally light on top of camera 3 glowed a sharp, steady crimson in a quiet television studio in Burbank on an afternoon in 1994. Ray Charles sat behind a glossy black grand piano, his head swaying gently from side to side in his trademark rhythmic motion. He wore a crisp, tailored black suit with a gold silk tie that caught the studio spotlights. The talk show host, Bob Costas, leaned forward in his leather armchair, resting his elbows on his knees. The studio audience sat in absolute silence, waiting for the legendary musician to play a few opening chords of a classic soul ballad. Instead, Costas cleared his throat and decided to steer the conversation away from the piano keys. He asked a direct, heavy question about the origin of rock and roll. Specifically, he wanted to know if Elvis Presley deserved his legendary title as the true pioneer who had successfully merged black rhythm and blues with white country music to create a brand new, global sound. The host expected a polite, standard industry answer. He expected Ray to smile, nod, and offer a few warm, generic compliments about the king of rock and roll. But Ray Charles did not play along with the Hollywood script. He stopped his swaying motion completely. He rested his hands flat on the polished wood of the piano fallboard, leaned directly toward the microphone, and let out a short, dry laugh that immediately cut through the warm atmosphere of the television set. What was the exact, unfiltered truth that Ray was about to deliver to millions of unsuspecting viewers watching at home? The answer did not come in the form of a long, angry rant. Ray simply spoke with a flat, quiet conviction that did not leave any room for debate. He looked toward the direction of the host's voice and stated that to say Elvis Presley pioneered rock and roll was a piece of pure historical fiction. He explained that Elvis was simply doing what black artists had already been doing in small, segregated clubs across the American South for decades, without a single television camera in sight. The studio grew noticeably colder as the host shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Costas tried to salvage the standard narrative by asking if Elvis's unique, high-energy performance style had at least brought a fresh, revolutionary spirit to the music. Ray's smile faded entirely. He shook his head slowly and pointed out that the wild hip-shaking, the frantic stage pacing, and the soulful vocal inflections were not invented by Elvis on a whim. Every single one of those signature moves had been lifted directly from the black gospel churches and blues joints that Elvis used to visit as a teenager in Memphis. Why did this sudden television broadcast send shockwaves through the entire music industry? The panic among the network executives was not about a simple difference of artistic opinion. It was about the fact that Ray Charles was dismantling a highly profitable, decades-old marketing myth on primetime television. For 40 years, the major record labels had spent millions of dollars promoting the idea that Elvis was a lone, mythical genius who had single-handedly broken down the racial barriers of the 1950s with his raw, natural talent. By stating the truth so plainly, Ray was forcing the public to look at the massive, uncomfortable machinery of the American music business. He was reminding the audience that the industry had systematically chosen to highlight a white face to sell black music to a wealthy, mainstream white audience. Ray's words were not an attack on Elvis's actual singing ability. Rather, they were a direct challenge to a system that had actively ignored the true creators of the art form simply because of the color of their skin. The host tried to change the subject, steering the interview back to Ray's own early gospel influences. But the damage to the polished myth was already done. The The phone lines at the television studio began ringing off the hook before the program had even finished airing on the West Coast. Furious Elvis fan clubs from across the country began drafting angry letters to the network, demanding a formal apology from the blind musician. Did Ray Charles regret speaking so bluntly on national television, or did he stand firmly by his words? The response from his personal manager's office the following morning settled the matter. Ray did not issue a retraction, nor did he offer a watered-down clarification to appease the angry fan clubs. He simply went back to his tour schedule, leaving his television comments to stand as a permanent, immovable marker in the history of American music criticism. He had pulled back the curtain on the industry's biggest secret, and the world of rock and roll would never look quite the same again. The real pioneers of the sound. The dry, splintering wood of a piano bench rattled inside a tiny, sweltering recording studio in New Orleans in October 1953. Ray Charles sat there in a damp, white undershirt, his fingers flying across the chipped ivory keys. He was recording a fast-paced rhythm and blues track for Atlantic Records. The air in the room was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco, stale coffee, and hot vacuum tubes from the bulky tape machines. A few blocks away, a young man named Richard Penniman, who would soon call himself Little Richard, was washing dishes at a Greyhound bus station, screaming his own wild melodies over the roar of the dishwashers. The history books written decades later would paint a very different picture of this era. They would claim that the entire country was sleeping soundly until 1954, when a young truck driver from Tupelo walked into Sun's studio and magically conjured a brand new musical style out of thin air. But to the musicians working the grueling southern circuits, this clean narrative was a total fantasy. What did the musical landscape of the Deep South actually sound like before the mainstream media discovered rock and roll? The answer was captured on the groove shellac of 78 RPM records that never made it to the white radio stations. In 1949, a wild blues singer named Wynanie Harris recorded a track called Good Rockin' Tonight. He yelled, he groaned, and he drove the band with a heavy, swinging backbeat that made people jump out of their seats. 5 years later, Elvis Presley walked into a Memphis studio and recorded that exact same song using the very same vocal hiccups and frantic pacing. Ray Charles knew these original records by heart. He had traveled thousands of miles across the country in the back of cramped, unheated station wagons, playing the Chitlin circuit alongside the men who actually built the foundation of the music. He had watched Guitar Slim stand on top of a wooden bar in 1951, screaming his guitar solos through a 100-foot-long cord while the crowd went wild. He had heard Big Joe Turner's booming voice rattle the windows of dance halls in Houston without the help of a microphone. These men were not playing traditional, slow acoustic blues. They were playing fast, aggressive, amplified music designed to make teenagers dance until their shoes wore out. They were writing the hooks, perfecting the wild stage presence, and driving the rhythm section years before Elvis ever bought his first acoustic guitar from a Tupelo hardware store. Why did the mainstream public remain completely oblivious to this massive musical revolution happening in their own backyards? The segregation laws of the 1950s did not just control where people sat on buses. They controlled the radio waves. White-owned radio stations in the North and South strictly refused to play records by black artists, labeling the music as race records or vulgar rhythm and blues. The major record labels would not sign black rock and roll artists, choosing instead to focus their marketing budgets on clean-cut white crooners. Then came Sam Phillips, the owner of Sun Studio in Memphis. Phillips was a shrewd businessman who understood the rigid rules of the segregated market perfectly. He famously told his assistant that if he could find a white man who had the black feel and the black sound, he could make $1 billion. He wasn't looking for a musical innovator. He was looking for a translator, a white face that could bypass the color line and gain access to the wealthy, mainstream white teenage market. In 1954, he found exactly what he was looking for. Elvis Presley was a talented young man who had grown up in a poor integrated neighborhood in Tupelo. He had spent his teenage years sneaking into black gospel tents on the edges of Memphis, absorbing the vocal techniques, the physical gestures, and the emotional intensity of the preachers. He wasn't trying to steal the music, he simply loved it. But the massive corporate machine that quickly bought his contract from Sun Records had a different agenda. RCA Victor did not market Elvis as a disciple of black music. They marketed him as the sole creator of the sound. They put his face on national television, printed millions of colorful, glossy magazines, and claimed he had single-handedly invented a brand new cultural phenomenon. The original pioneers, the men who had actually written the songs and spent decades developing the style, were pushed deep into the shadows. Ray Charles watched this process unfold from the stage of his own sold-out theater shows. He saw the white cover versions of black songs climbing to the top of the Billboard charts, while the original recordings remained stuck in the lower-paying regional markets. He did not hold a personal grudge against Elvis for his success. He understood that Elvis was just a young singer caught up in a massive, profitable corporate storm. But Ray refused to let the history books erase the contributions of his peers. Whenever a music critic asked him about the origins of rock and roll during his long career, Ray would patiently rattle off the names of the men he had shared the stage with in the early 50s. He would talk about Charles Brown, Louis Jordan, and Roy Brown. He would tell the stories of the hot, sweaty Southern halls where the music was actually born, long before it was sanitized for television. He wanted the world to understand that rock and roll was not a sudden miracle that happened in a clean Memphis recording studio. It was a rich, complex black art form that had been built piece by piece, song by song, by a generation of brilliant, overlooked artists who had paved the way in the dark. The privilege of the color line. A pair of heavy, chrome-plated television cameras rolled slowly across the concrete floor of CBS Studio 50 in New York on September 9th, 1956. The red lights on top of the lenses clicked on. A technician in a headset waved his hand, signaling the start of the live national broadcast. Outside the theater, police officers struggled to hold back a crowd of thousands of teenage girls chanting Elvis Presley's name. Inside the studio, the host, Ed Sullivan, stood before the microphone to introduce the night's main attraction. But the camera operators had received a highly unusual, strict directive from the network executive producers sitting in the control booth. They were ordered to keep the lenses framed tightly from the singer's waist up. Whenever Elvis began to slide his feet or shake his hips to the rhythm of the music, the cameras quickly zoomed in on his face, hiding his lower body from the home audience. The network brass feared that showing those movements on a Sunday evening would spark a massive wave of moral panic across Middle America. They believed these suggestive, high-energy motions were too vulgar for decent living rooms. But the television censors were fighting a losing battle against a cultural shift they had already fully funded. What made this desperate attempt at television censorship so deeply hypocritical to black artists watching from the wings? The answer lay in the double standard of 1950s entertainment laws. Just 2 years earlier, a popular black vocal group called the Larks had performed on a similar live television program. They had dared to slide across the stage and drop to their knees during their routine. The response from the network executives had been immediate and severe. They were banned from future television appearances, their contracts were quietly canceled, and their records were pulled from mainstream store shelves. The industry labeled black performers who moved with rhythm as dangerous, primitive, and sexually explicit. Yet, when a young white man from Memphis copied those exact same movements, he wasn't banned from the airwaves. He was paid $50,000 for 3 brief television appearances. Ray Charles watched this stark division play out from his seat on a Greyhound bus traveling through Georgia. He bought the daily newspapers at the bus stops, reading the sensational headlines about how Elvis was supposedly corrupting the youth of America with his wild, original stage presence. Ray didn't buy the moral panic, and he certainly didn't buy the originality angle. He had spent his childhood watching preachers in the Southern Baptist churches move with that exact same frantic spiritual energy. He had seen old bluesmen in the Georgia clubs shake their shoulders and drop to their knees to get the crowd moving. To Ray, the double standard was a simple matter of real estate. Skin color acted as a golden passport that allowed a performer to bypass the cultural border guards. A white artist could walk through the front door of a television studio and be celebrated as a daring rebel for doing what a black artist would be arrested for doing at a local dance hall. Did the black community openly protest this massive, glaring injustice at the time? The historical record from that era reveals a quiet, strategic silence. Black musicians in 1956 could not afford to start public boycotts or complained to the mainstream newspapers. Doing so would guarantee their records were completely blacklisted by white distributors. Instead, they kept their heads down, continued to write the songs, and quietly watched the royalties flow into other bank accounts. Ray Charles understood the rules of the game better than most. He did not waste his energy on bitter public statements. He focused on his own music, slowly building an empire by demanding absolute control over his master recordings. He was determined to make sure he received proper payment for his work, even if he couldn't get the same television exposure as his white counterparts. The industry continued to profit from the division. While Elvis was flying in custom airplanes and receiving police escorts through city streets, the very artists who had inspired his style were still navigating the harsh realities of the Jim Crow South. They were still forced to enter through the back doors of the theaters they sold out, eat their meals in the kitchens of the hotels where they performed, and use segregated restrooms. The color line remained firmly in place, even as the music of the Black South became the soundtrack of the entire nation. Ray Charles never forgot the stark images of those 1950s television broadcasts. He knew that the system had deliberately chosen to put a white face on a black cultural revolution because it was the only way to make the music respectable to a wealthy, segregated country. He did not hold a grudge against the young singer from Tupelo, but he refused to let the world pretend the playing field had ever been level. The copycat controversy. A heavy grease-stained cardboard box sat in the corner of a crowded basement office on Broadway in New York in March 1957. The label on the box was handwritten in fading black ink, Peacock Records. Inside, hundreds of unsold 10-inch shellac records lay pressed together, their black grooves holding a recording of a song called Hound Dog, sung by a 30-year-old black woman named Willie Mae Big Mama Thornton. The original record had been released in 1953. It featured a slow, dirty guitar riff and a vocal performance that sounded like a warning. A few miles away, in a towering skyscraper uptown, the executives at RCA Victor were busy counting the massive weekly profits from Elvis Presley's 1956 version of that exact same song. Elvis's cover of Hound Dog did not just sell well, it became a global cultural earthquake. But behind the record-breaking sales numbers, a devastating economic reality was playing out for the original creators of the music. How much money did Big Mama Thornton actually receive for her role in creating one of the most famous rock and roll songs in history? The answer was a source of deep, lasting anger for musicians who knew the inside workings of the business. The record label accounting books from 1957 showed that Thornton was paid a single flat fee of $500 for her recording session. She did not own the publishing rights. She did not receive a single penny in royalties from the millions of copies Elvis sold. She remained in a small rented room in Houston, Texas, while the songs she made famous funded the purchase of private jets and custom tour buses in Memphis. Ray Charles watched this dynamic play out with a cold, clear understanding of how the publishing industry worked. He had met Big Mama Thornton on the touring circuit in the early 50s. He had seen her walk onto the stage of the Apollo Theater in a pair of men's work boots, commanding the room with nothing but the sheer power of her voice. He knew she wasn't just a singer. She was a master of rhythm, a woman who had taught her band exactly how to lay down the heavy, swinging beat that Elvis later copied note for note. The problem was not that Elvis had decided to cover the song. Musicians had been covering each other's material since the invention of the phonograph. The real issue was the systematic legal theft of black intellectual property. The white-owned publishing companies had developed a highly effective system to exploit the lack of legal representation among black artists in the Jim Crow South. They would buy the rights to a black-written song for a few dollars cash, register the copyright under their own names, and then hand the music to a white artist for a national release. The white artist's version would receive massive radio play, while the original creator's name was quietly erased from the credits. Did Ray Charles allow himself to be caught in this same predatory trap? The way Ray handled his own music in the late 50s showed his genius extended far beyond the piano keys. He flatly refused to sign standard contracts that gave away his publishing rights. When he negotiated his historic deal with ABC Paramount Records in 1959, he insisted on a clause that was completely unheard of for a black artist at the time. He demanded full ownership of his master recordings. He knew that the only way to survive the copycat system was to own the raw material himself. But most black artists of his generation did not have the leverage to make those kinds of demands. They had to take whatever cash the labels offered just to pay their rent and keep their tour buses running. The public continued to believe the marketing claims that Elvis was the sole creative force behind his biggest hits. They did not know that Tutti Frutti belonged to Little Richard, or that Mystery Train had been written and originally recorded by Junior Parker. They did not know that the signature vocal style Elvis used on Don't Be Cruel was a direct copy of Otis Blackwell's original demo tape. Otis Blackwell was a brilliant black songwriter who wrote some of Elvis's most legendary tracks, including All Shook Up and Fever. Yet, Blackwell was so poor, he had to sell his songwriting credits to Elvis's management team just to get his work recorded. He was forced to share credit with Elvis on songs the King had never even heard until the final recording sessions. Ray Charles often spoke about this specific dynamic during his late-night dressing room conversations with other musicians. He observed that the industry was not just covering songs, they were covering up the very existence of the original artists. He saw how the history of American music was being systematically rewritten to present a safe, white-friendly narrative that ignored the brilliant minds who had actually built the house. He refused to let the names of his friends be forgotten. Whenever he performed on television in the 60s and 70s, Ray made a point of introducing his songs by naming the original black writers and singers who had inspired his arrangements. He used his own massive fame to shine a spotlight back onto the people the industry had tried to push into the dark. He wanted his audience to understand that every great American hook had a history, and most of those histories began in the segregated neighborhoods of the South, long before they ever reached the top of the pop charts. A quiet, professional respect. A heavy reel of magnetic recording tape spun slowly on a gray metal Ampex machine inside a private studio in Los Angeles in October 1966. Ray Charles sat back in his leather swivel chair, his head tilted toward the wood-paneled ceiling. He wasn't listening to one of his own rhythm and blues master tapes. Instead, the high-pitched soaring vocal of Elvis Presley singing a traditional black gospel hymn, Milky White Way, filled the small, warm room. Ray's right hand tapped a steady, gentle rhythm against his knee, matching the swing of the vocal track. His face did not carry the sharp, critical expression he often wore when discussing the predatory nature of the music industry. Instead, he let out a quiet grunt of approval as the final organ chord faded from the speakers. To the mainstream public, Ray Charles was the fierce, uncompromising defender of black musical history. He was the man who refused to let white-owned corporate record labels rewrite the past to suit their own financial agendas. People naturally assumed he harbored a deep, burning resentment toward the king of rock and roll. But the private reality of his feelings was far more complex than a simple story of bitter, racially charged rivalry. Did Ray believe Elvis actually understood the spiritual depth of the music he copied? Or was it all just a superficial imitation designed to make a quick fortune? The answer to that question lay in the dusty wooden pews of the East Trigg Baptist Church in Memphis during the late 1948 church services. A young teenage Elvis Presley used to slip quietly into the very back row of the segregated church, sitting on the hard benches in his faded denim shirt. He spent long Sunday afternoons listening to the roaring, emotional sermons of the Reverend W. Herbert Brewster and the high-energy harmonies of the local gospel choirs. He wasn't there with photographers, newspaper reporters, or managers. He went because he was genuinely moved by the raw, emotional power of the singing. Ray Charles knew about these quiet, teenage Memphis church visits. He understood that Elvis's connection to black Southern music was not a calculated business strategy cooked up by slick Hollywood executives. Elvis actually loved the music down to his very bones. Ray recognized this authentic passion whenever he listened to Elvis's early records. During his own late-night band rehearsals, Ray would occasionally tell his musicians that, while the industry itself was deeply corrupt, the boy from Tupelo was not a fake. He possessed a natural, soulful instrument that could never be manufactured by a corporate marketing team. He was a beautiful singer who had a genuine, instinctual feel for the blues. What was the one specific musical genre where Ray believed Elvis was completely unmatched by any other white artist of his era? The truth was revealed during a quiet backstage conversation at the Olympia Theatre in Paris in 1968. A French music journalist asked Ray if he thought any white vocalist could truly capture the deep, emotional weight of traditional Southern spirituals. Ray didn't hesitate for a single second. He immediately named Elvis Presley's 1957 recording of Peace in the Valley. Ray pointed out that on that specific recording, Elvis wasn't trying to shake his hips, tease the crowd, or play the part of a wild rock and roll rebel. He was singing straight from his heart, using a rich, controlled baritone that showed a deep, fundamental respect for the sacred material. To Ray, that performance was concrete proof that Elvis possessed a genuine soul, even if the corporate system around him kept trying to turn him into a shallow, marketable product. The two legendary musicians never shared a public stage, and they never recorded a high-budget duet inside a studio. Their paths crossed only in the quiet, empty corridors of the major recording studios and through the mutual respect of their musical arrangements. Elvis was a massive fan of Ray's innovative work. In 1969, when Elvis returned to the live stage in Las Vegas, after a decade of making formulaic Hollywood movies, he chose to open his show with a high-energy cover of Ray Charles's signature hit, I Got a Woman. Elvis performed the song with a frantic, respectful energy, giving full vocal credit to the blind genius who had written the original track. When a touring reporter later told Ray about Elvis using his song to launch his massive live comeback, Ray didn't complain about the cover version or demand extra royalty payments. He simply smiled, took a sip of his coffee, and remarked that he was glad the boy still had excellent taste in music. He understood that Elvis was paying a sincere, professional tribute to the roots of his own musical education. But Ray's respect for Elvis's talent did not make him blind to the tragic, suffocating nature of the king's life. From his own experiences of navigating the grueling demands of international fame, Ray recognized the heavy toll of the golden cage that Colonel Tom Parker had built around his star client. He saw a young man who had been completely cut off from the real world, surrounded by a thick wall of yes-men who were terrified of losing their weekly allowances. Elvis was forced to remain frozen in time, playing the same cartoonish, high-collared character night after night for a wealthy, demanding Las Vegas audience that didn't care about his physical or mental decay. Ray often compared Elvis's fate to a wild bird trapped inside a beautiful diamond-encrusted cage. He remarked to his close friends that Elvis had all the money in the world, but he didn't have the freedom to walk down the street, sit in a quiet diner, or simply sing the music he wanted to sing without a massive corporate committee approving the decision first. Ray had fought tooth and nail for his own creative freedom, choosing to own his master recordings and make his own artistic choices, even when it meant earning less money in the short term. He looked at Elvis's golden prison with a deep sense of professional pity, knowing that the very system that had crowned Elvis king had also guaranteed his tragic early destruction. When the news of Elvis's sudden death reached Ray's tour bus in August 1977, he did not join in the sensationalist media circus that immediately flooded the television airwaves. He refused to give cheap, sentimental quotes to the tabloid newspapers looking to exploit the tragedy. Instead, he sat quietly in his dressing room, listening to an old 78 RPM gospel record. He knew that the loud commercial monster of the Elvis legacy would continue to grow, but the real fragile man who had sneaked into the back of those Memphis churches was finally at peace. Ray Charles's ultimate verdict on Elvis Presley was not defined by bitterness, jealousy, or anger. It was defined by a rare, razor-sharp clarity that separated the artist from the corrupt industry that exploited him. He was willing to fight the corporate myth of the king with everything he had, but he was also the first to defend the beautiful, soulful voice of the boy who had simply wanted to sing the blues. Rewriting the history books. A high school history teacher in Memphis slid a heavy stack of newly printed textbooks onto his desk in September 2005. He sliced the plastic wrapping off the top book and opened the first chapter. For decades, this specific curriculum had featured a large, glossy photo of Elvis Presley on the very first page of the modern music section. The caption underneath had always labeled him as the undisputed creator of rock and roll, but this year, the photograph on page 14 was completely different. It showed a sharp, black and white image of Sister Rosetta Tharpe, clutching her white electric guitar on a rain-slicked train platform in England. The text beneath her name explained how her gospel-infused guitar style had directly inspired every single rock musician who followed her, including the king himself. This major shift in the education system did not happen by accident. It was the direct result of a decade-long quiet war fought by veteran musicians who refused to let their heritage be erased from the history books. What was the unexpected consequence when a major Southern university tried to publish a definitive, authorized biography of Elvis Presley in 1998? The university press had compiled thousands of pages of interviews with childhood friends, early promoters, and studio engineers. They expected to print a standard celebratory volume that would sell thousands of copies to eager tourists. But when the editors began reaching out to surviving black musicians in Memphis for their personal recollections, they hit a solid wall of resistance. The artists flatly refused to grant permission for their names or quotes to be used in the book. They made a simple, collective demand. They would only participate if the book's first 3 chapters were entirely rewritten to properly credit the black mentors who had actually taught Elvis how to play the guitar and project his voice. The publishers, realizing they could not print an authentic history without these voices, agreed to the terms. The resulting biography became one of the first mainstream academic books to paint an honest, balanced picture of cultural exchange in the Jim Crow South. Ray Charles watched these changes from his home in Beverly Hills. He didn't need to read the academic textbooks to know that the cultural tide was finally turning. He could hear the difference in the way younger generations spoke about music. The raw, unfiltered comments he had made on national television in 1994 had acted as a powerful catalyst, giving other artists the courage to speak their own truths without fear of corporate blacklisting. But how did Ray's bold stand on television change the actual financial legacy for the families of the original, forgotten songwriters? The impact went far beyond mere historical credit. In 1999, inspired by Ray's public statements, a group of entertainment attorneys and music historians formed the Rhythm and Blues Foundation. They established a specialized legal defense fund designed to audit the old royalty accounts of the major record labels from the 1950s and 60s. They targeted the classic hits that had been covered by white artists and sold to millions of buyers worldwide. The lawyers uncovered a massive systematic trail of unpaid publishing fees and forged contracts. They took these findings directly to the federal courts, launching a series of high-profile lawsuits against the giant music conglomerates. By the summer of 2003, the foundation had successfully recovered over $20 million in back royalties. These lost funds were quietly distributed to the elderly writers and their surviving children, many of whom had been living in near poverty, while their songs continued to play on global radio stations. The families of artists like Otis Blackwell and Big Mama Thornton finally received the financial security and legal recognition they had been denied for half a century. This was the practical, life-changing justice that Ray Charles had spent his entire life fighting for. He had always maintained that acknowledging the true roots of rock and roll was not about tearing down Elvis Presley's genuine talent. It was about ensuring that the people who built the foundation were not left to starve in the shadows while their creations built corporate empires. In May 2004, just a month before his death, Ray received a Special Achievement Award from the National Academy of Recording Arts. The presenter read a long list of his historic achievements, praising him for his unmatched ability to break down the rigid barriers between gospel, country, jazz, and blues. Ray sat in his wheelchair on the stage, his head tilted back, a soft smile on his face. He didn't offer a long, formal speech. He simply thanked the audience and remarked that the music had always belonged to everyone, but the history belonged to the truth. Today, visitors who walk through the updated exhibits at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland see a much larger story than the one told in the 1950s. They see the names of Big Joe Turner, Laverne Baker, and Wynonie Harris placed on the same level of prominence as Elvis Presley. The exhibits detail the complex, often painful reality of how the music was shared, borrowed, and sometimes stolen during a dark era of American segregation. The myth of the lone white genius who invented rock and roll has been permanently replaced by a richer, far more honest narrative of American culture. The credit is finally being shared by those who earned it on the dusty stages of the Chitlin circuit. Ray Charles's sharp, uncompromising voice on that quiet television set in Burbank had opened the eyes of a nation, proving that while a crown can be bought by a corporate marketing machine, the true origin of the sound can never be hidden forever. American music history is rarely as clean as the record labels claim. Elvis Presley was a massive force, but as Ray Charles boldly reminded the world, no king builds his throne alone. It was raised on the backs of brilliant, overlooked black artists who paved the way in the Southern shadows.